The plate hit the table before Lavinia Townsend opened her mouth to ask for it. She stood in the doorway of the Donovan Ranch house, trail dust still settling on her shoulders, her carpetbag hanging from fingers gone white with exhaustion, and she watched the youngest boy, could not have been more than 9 years old, slide a tin plate across the worn oak table with a quiet certainty that stopped her breathing entirely. Not because the gesture was small, because it was not small at all. Because in 31 years of living, no one had ever anticipated her needs. Not her father, not the man she had nearly married, not the aunts who had passed her between themselves like an unwanted parcel after her mother died. No one had ever looked at her and known, before she asked, that she was hungry and tired and so desperately in need of something as simple as a place at a table. She looked at the boy. Then she looked at Bernard Donovan, who stood at the far end of that same table with his hat in his hands, and an expression on his face she could not yet read, something carved out of years of silence, something raw underneath the stone, and she felt the ground shift beneath her boots in a way that had nothing to do with the long miles she had traveled from Abilene. "You knew I was coming," she said. It was not quite a question. Bernard Donovan did not answer right away. He set his hat on the hook beside the door with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing his words the same way he chose everything, slowly, with his whole attention. His boys, all three of them, stood in a loose arrangement around the table. Elias, the eldest at 14, lean and watchful. Samuel, 11, with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, which Lavinia did not yet know but would come to understand. And then little Thomas, 9, who had slid the plate and was now watching her with an openness his father had long since buried. "We knew someone was coming," Bernard said finally. "Thomas decided it would be you. Thomas has never met me." "No," Bernard agreed, "but he dreamed it. The absurdity of it should have made her laugh." She had come to this ranch in the New Mexico Territory in the autumn of 1882 under circumstances that were already complicated and already shadowed by secrets she had not yet shared with the man who had written to her through the Abilene matrimonial register. She had come because she had no other choice, which was itself a secret she carried like a stone in her chest. And yet, standing there in the lamplight with a tin plate set before her by a child who had dreamed her arrival, Lavinia Townsend felt something crack open in the hard shell she had built around herself during the worst years of her life. She sat down. She let Thomas fill her cup with water from the tin pitcher. She picked up the fork and she ate, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt she might survive whatever came next. What came next, as it happened, was Bernard Donovan himself, and he was far more dangerous to her heart than she had prepared for. She had not come to the New Mexico Territory looking for love. Let that be clear from the very beginning, because nothing about this story is simple, and nothing about Lavinia Townsend is what it first appears to be. She had come looking for safety. She had come because a man named Harlan Greer was looking for her, and because Harlan Greer had resources and connections, and a particular kind of cold fury that had already cost one person their life, and might very well cost her hers if she stayed anywhere he might find her. The story began, as most stories of betrayal do, somewhere much quieter than a confrontation. Lavinia had been born in 1851 in Galveston, Texas, the only child of a cotton merchant named Elias Townsend, and a woman named Clara who had loved poetry and died of fever when Lavinia was 11. After Clara died, Elias Townsend had retreated into his accounts and his whiskey, and Lavinia had retreated into books, and between the two of them they had managed a functional silence for 7 years before Elias died too, of a heart that had simply stopped, and left Lavinia with a modest inheritance and no particular plan. She had tried teaching school in Galveston, then in San Antonio. She had tried being a seamstress. She had spent one genuinely awful year living with her Aunt Delphine in New Orleans, where Delphine had attempted repeatedly to marry her off to men of means, and Lavinia had refused them all, not out of pride, but out of a bone-deep instinct that something was wrong with each of them, an instinct she had learned to trust because the alternative was a dark past that swallowed women whole. She had been 28 when she met Harlan Greer, which meant she had been old enough to know better and young enough to believe the exceptions existed. Harlan Greer was a land agent in Abilene, Kansas. He wore good suits and had a genuinely pleasant laugh and knew everyone worth knowing in 3 counties. He had a way of making a woman feel like the most important person in any room, which Lavinia recognized in retrospect as a skill rather than a feeling, but which had felt like salvation at the time. He had courted her with letters and flowers, and the kind of patient attention she had never received from anyone. He had proposed in the spring of 1880, and she had accepted, and she had been happy for exactly 4 months. The first warning was a letter she was not supposed to see. It had arrived at the boarding house where she kept rooms, addressed to Harlan, and the landlady had given it to Lavinia by mistake, and Lavinia had opened it before she noticed the name. Inside was a careful accounting of a land transaction involving property that the letter referred to as recently cleared, and a name she did not recognize attached to a sum of money that was very large, and references to a previous arrangement that had been, according to the letter, cleanly handled. She had given the letter to Harlan and said nothing. She had watched his face when he read it. She had seen, in the space between his reading it and his looking up at her with the pleasant, easy smile, something she could only describe afterward as the absence of anything human. She had begun, quietly, to investigate. What she found was not something she could prove in any court in Kansas in 1880. What she found was a pattern land that changed hands under unusual circumstances, homesteaders who had applied for legal title, and then simply stopped appearing in public records, a trail of transactions that always ended with Harlan Greer holding the deed. She found a man named Cy Watkins who had been willing to talk to her, a former clerk in the county recorder's office who had seen enough to be frightened, and who had tried to file a complaint, and found himself dismissed from his position within a week of doing so. Cy Watkins was found dead of what was ruled an accidental fall down a ravine outside of Abilene in November of 1880. Lavinia had broken her engagement the following morning. She had told Harlan it was because she had fallen out of feeling for him, which he had accepted with a smile that did not reach his eyes, and she had understood in that moment that she had made a very serious enemy. She spent the next 2 years in Abilene because leaving suddenly would have confirmed his suspicions and because she was, underneath the careful exterior she presented to the world, genuinely brave. She taught school. She kept her evidence, what little evidence she had, in a leather-bound journal hidden under a loose board beneath her wardrobe. She wrote letters to a circuit judge she believed was honest and received no responses. She wrote to a newspaper in Topeka, and the letter she sent was never published. And then, in the late summer of 1882, one of Harlan Greer's associates had come to call at the boarding house while Lavinia was out, had convinced the landlady to show him her rooms, and had left without taking anything visible. When Lavinia came home that evening, she knew by the way her wardrobe door sat she had learned in 2 years of quiet fear to notice everything, that someone had searched her room. The journal was still there, but they had been looking. She had written to the Abilene Matrimonial Register that same night. She had answered 3 advertisements and had chosen Bernard Donovan's because it was the most straightforward. He had not described himself as romantic or adventurous. He had not promised happiness. He had written, "I am a widower with 3 boys and a working ranch in the New Mexico territory. I need a steady hand and a willing heart. I offer an honest home and honest work, and nothing I have not got." She had found that more reassuring than anything poetic might have been. She had packed her carpet bag and her hidden journal and 1 photograph of her mother, and left Abilene on the morning stage without telling anyone where she was going, which was itself a kind of courage and a kind of loneliness she could not yet distinguish from each other. The journey had taken 11 days by stage and rail, with a night in Santa Fe where she had slept poorly and eaten badly, and then a bone-rattling wagon ride of 40 miles southeast from the nearest rail station at Las Vegas, New Mexico, during which she had composed and discarded 3 different opening speeches for Bernard Donovan, and arrived at his ranch gate with nothing prepared, and a plate set before her before she could ask for it. That first night she slept in the room they had prepared for her, small and clean, with a window that faced east and a quilt on the bed that had been washed recently, which she noticed because the smell of lye soap was still faint in the fabric. She lay awake longer than she should have, listening to the sounds of the ranch settle around her, the horses shifting in the barn, the wind coming off the high desert, the particular silence of a house where children lived and slept and were, for the moment, safe. She thought about Bernard Donovan's hands. This was not the kind of thought she had expected to be having on her first night at a stranger's ranch. But she had noticed them at dinner, large hands, weathered, with a scar along the left thumb that ran in a clean white line across the knuckle, and a gentleness in the way he had poured water for Thomas that seemed completely at odds with the rest of him. He was not a large man precisely, but he was a solid one, the kind of solid that comes from years of physical work that has nothing to prove. He had brown hair going to gray at the temples, brown eyes, and a face that had clearly once been handsome, and was now something better, interesting, weighted, marked by time. He had not smiled at her at dinner. He had been polite and attentive, and had asked her 3 practical questions about her journey and whether she had any dietary restrictions, which no one had ever asked her before. He had not smiled, but when Thomas had said something in his earnest 9-year-old way about the plate he had set, Bernard had looked at his youngest son with an expression that contained more tenderness than most men showed in a decade, and Lavinia had felt, in the pit of her stomach, a kind of warning she did not want to heed. She was not here to fall in love. She was here to survive. Those were not the same thing. In the morning she woke before dawn because she always did, and she went to the kitchen and found Bernard already there, standing at the iron stove with a coffee pot and the particular stillness of a man accustomed to being the first one awake in a house full of sleepers. He looked at her when she came in. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "You are up early," he said. "I always am," she said. "May I help?" He handed her the coffee pot without ceremony and pointed at the shelf where the coffee beans were kept in a tin. She ground them at the small hand mill on the counter and put them in the pot and set it on the stove, and they stood on opposite sides of the kitchen in the gray pre-dawn quiet, and she thought, this might actually work. She had not allowed herself that thought during the entire 11 days of travel. She had kept it carefully locked away because hope, in her experience, was the most dangerous thing a woman in her position could carry. The boys came to breakfast in order of age, which she would later learn was habit and not instruction. Elias first, already dressed and self-contained, eating quickly and going out to the barn without being asked. Samuel next, cheerful and talkative in the unfocused way of children who have not quite woken up, asking her a string of questions about Abilene that she answered carefully. Thomas last, still half asleep, who sat beside her without any apparent self-consciousness and ate his eggs with concentrated seriousness. After breakfast, Bernard showed her the ranch. It was not a tour designed to impress. He showed her the functional things, the root cellar and the smokehouse and the chicken run and the kitchen garden, which was in a state of respectable neglect. He showed her where the water was and where it was not, and how the hand pump in the yard sometimes needed persuading, and where the extra lamp oil was kept. He showed her the barn and introduced her to the horses with the same gravity he used to introduce her to his sons, which she found endearing in a way she did not want to examine too closely. "The ranch runs about 400 head," he said, standing at the fence of the north pasture in the warm morning light. "Elias and I handle most of the cattle work. I have 2 hands who come in during the roundup season. Samuel helps where he can. Thomas is," he paused, and a ghost of something moved across his face, "Thomas is gifted with the horses." "He is gifted with other things as well," Lavinia said. Bernard turned to look at her. She had not planned to say that, and she felt the oddness of having said it, but she held his gaze because she had learned long ago that looking away first was a form of surrender. "He told me about the dream," he said. "I hope that did not." "It did not," she said. "It was the kindest welcome I have ever received." He looked at her for a long moment with those dark brown eyes that had been trained by years of work and lost to miss very little. Then he nodded once, as if she had confirmed something, and turned back toward the ranch house, and she followed. They spent the first week in a careful, practical negotiation that had the structure of business and the undertone of something else entirely. She took over the kitchen with his permission and improved the dinner situation significantly, because, whatever Bernard Donovan's virtues were, cooking was not among them, and his boys had been eating the same 4 things on rotation for what appeared to be years. She reorganized the root cellar and mended the kitchen garden. She taught Thomas and Samuel their letters in the afternoons, and was startled to discover that Elias, who had seemed indifferent to her presence, would sometimes come and sit at the edge of the kitchen while she taught the younger boys, listening without appearing to listen. She and Bernard fell into a routine of mornings and evenings, the quiet times of the day when the boys were occupied elsewhere and the ranch settled into itself. They drank coffee. They talked about practical things first, the fence line and the coming winter and the price of beef in Las Vegas, and then gradually about other things. He told her about Catherine, his wife, who had died of childbed fever 3 years earlier when Thomas was 6, and he told it in the flat, careful way of a man who has learned to talk about the wound without reopening it, which she recognized because she had learned the same skill. She did not tell him about Harlan Greer. Not then. She knew she would have to. She knew the secrets she carried were not the kind that could stay hidden indefinitely, not in the small world of a working ranch where news traveled in and out with the mail rider and the supply wagons. But she told herself there would be a right moment, a moment when she knew whether Bernard Donovan was the kind of man who could be trusted with something that might put his family at risk, and she kept that moment at a distance while she gathered evidence of who he was. The evidence was consistently confusing to her fixed assumptions. He was not warm, not in the way that men who wished to impress women were warm. He did not flatter her or seek her approval or perform consideration. He was simply considerate, in the steady, undemonstrative way of a man who had learned that care was a practice and not a performance. He noticed when she had had a hard day. He did not say much about it. He simply put an extra log on the fire or took on a task she had been dreading without being asked. He gave her the kind of quiet attention that felt, after years of Harlan Greer's theatrical devotion, like the first honest thing she had encountered in a very long time. 3 weeks in, he kissed her. It was an accident, which is to say it was not planned by either of them and was preceded by an argument. They had been arguing about Thomas. Lavinia had noticed that Thomas did not attend the schoolhouse in town, which was 12 miles from the ranch, and which Elias and Samuel rode to on horseback 3 days a week in fair weather. When she asked Bernard why Thomas did not go, he said that Thomas did well enough with what she was teaching him, and that the ride was too long for a 9-year-old. She said that Thomas was clearly very bright and deserved more than kitchen-table arithmetic. He said that he knew his son and was capable of deciding what was best for him. She said that she had noticed he kept Thomas closer to home than the other boys, and was that about what was best for Thomas or about what was best for Bernard? That was where the argument became something else. He had looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, not anger exactly, but something rower, something shaken loose from under the stone surface he maintained. He said very quietly that Thomas was the one who had been home when Catherine died, that Thomas was 6 years old and had run for help and had not made it in time and had not spoken for 4 months afterward, that Thomas still had nightmares. That sending Thomas 12 miles away 3 days a week was not something Bernard was willing to do regardless of what arithmetic lessons he might be missing. Lavinia had said, "I did not know. I am sorry." He had said, "I should have told you. That is on me." And then they had been standing very close together in the narrow space between the kitchen table and the stove, and the apology had shifted the air between them, and he had looked at her with something so open and so undone that she had leaned toward him without deciding to, and he had met her halfway with complete certainty, and it was brief and careful and not at all accidental. When they separated, she felt the ground shift again, and this time she understood what the shifting meant. She went to her room that night and took the journal from under the loose board she had transferred it to in the gap beneath her wardrobe here, and she read through the evidence against Harlan Greer, and she thought about what it meant to involve Bernard in this, because involving him was now inevitable. She had moved past the point where she could tell herself this was temporary and functional and would leave no mark on either of them. She was falling in love with Bernard Donovan. That was a hidden truth she had been carrying for 3 weeks and could no longer pretend was not there. And loving someone created the obligation to tell them the truth, and the truth was going to complicate everything. She told him the following Sunday, which was the one day of the week the boys went to church in town with the nearest neighboring family, the Cardwells, who had 6 children and a wagon big enough to carry extras. Bernard did not go to church. He had explained this early on without apology. He had stopped going after Catherine died and had not found his way back, and the Lord and he were currently in a state of negotiation. She waited until she heard the Cardwells' wagon pull away, and then she came to the kitchen where he was already sitting with his coffee, and she sat across from him and put the journal on the table between them. She told him everything. She told him about Harlan Greer and the land transactions, and Cy Watkins and the searched room and the flight from Abilene. She told it in the same flat, careful way she had heard him talk about Catherine, the way you talk about a wound you have learned to carry. She told him the whole dark past, and then she stopped talking and looked at him and waited. He did not speak immediately. He picked up the journal and opened it and read several pages. He put it down. He picked up his coffee. He put it down. He said, "This man, he knows you left Abilene." "Yes," she said. "Does he know where you went?" "I do not believe so. I was careful, but I do not know for certain." He nodded. He was quiet for another moment. She watched him and waited, and the waiting was the hardest thing she had done since she had left Abilene. He said, "I am not afraid of him," she said. "I am, and you should be too. He has resources." "So do I," Bernard said. "Different ones." He paused. "The judge in Las Vegas, Marcus Holt, he is an honest man. I have known him for 8 years. We round up cattle together every other spring." He tapped the journal. "This and your account of Watkins and the land records, if they can be pulled, it might be enough." She stared at him. "You believe me?" He looked at her as if the question was genuinely strange to him. "Of course I believe you," he said. "Why would you make this up?" She could not answer that immediately because no one had ever said "of course I believe you" to her in her entire life, and the simplicity of it dismantled something in her chest. "I did not come here to bring trouble to you and your boys," she said, when she trusted herself to speak. "No," he said. "You came here because you were running out of places to be safe, and someone who read my advertisement thought a ranch in the New Mexico territory was far enough from Kansas to be useful." He was not accusing her of this. He was stating it plainly, without judgment. "I am not offended by that. I am glad you came." He paused. "I need you to understand that. I am glad you came for whatever reason, because you are, what is happening here is." He stopped. He looked out the window at the yard and then back at her. "I have not felt this particular way since Catherine was alive, and I had not expected to feel it again. And I am not a man who wastes time pretending he does not feel things he clearly feels." Lavinia Townsend, who had not cried when she fled Abilene, or when she rode 11 days through unfamiliar country, or when she sat alone in a Santa Fe hotel room and wondered if she had made the worst mistake of her life, felt her eyes fill without warning. Bernard did not make a ceremony of it. He moved his chair around to her side of the table and sat beside her and put his large, weathered hand over hers on the table, and she turned her hand over and held his. And outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek with a sound like the world exhaling. They sat that way for a long time, and when the boys came home at midday, Thomas walked in and saw their linked hands on the table and smiled with the total uncomplicated happiness of a child who had dreamed something and then watched it come true. The letter arrived in the 3rd week of October, which was 3 weeks after her confession, and 1 week after Bernard Donovan had ridden to Las Vegas to see Judge Marcus Holt about the contents of a certain leather-bound journal. The letter was from Abilene. It was not from Harlan Greer. It was from a woman named Pearl Simmons, who had once been Lavinia's neighbor at the boarding house, and who was not a clever woman but was a loyal one, and who had written in a hand full of crossed letters to warn Lavinia that a man had been asking after her at the boarding house and in town, a man with a pleasant manner and very cold eyes, and that he had apparently gotten some information from someone, because the questions he was asking had become more specific. Lavinia brought the letter to Bernard that evening after the boys were in bed. He read it. His jaw tightened. He set the letter on the table and was quiet for a moment in the way she was learning to recognize not absence but presence, that concentrated inner attention that preceded a decision. "Marcus Holt sent me a letter this week," he said. "He has been working with a man in Topeka, a federal investigator. The land records are on their way to him now. He says if the records match your journal entries, there is a case to be built." "How long does that take?" He could not say. Weeks, possibly months. He looked at her steadily. "In the meantime, Greer is looking for you." "Yes. I want to go to Tom Barrett in Wagon Mound," he said. Tom Barrett was the county sheriff, a man whose name came up frequently in Bernard's accounting of the local landscape, reliable, experienced, the kind of law enforcement that the territory actually had in 1882, which was functional but limited. "I want to tell him what is coming and give him a copy of the journal pages. That way, if anything happens, nothing is going to happen," Lavinia said. "Lavinia," his voice was even and very certain, "something may happen." That is not pessimism. That is the honest assessment of a man who has lost someone before and is not willing to be unprepared again. She looked at him and felt the weight of what he was carrying, the years of raising 3 boys alone, the daily vigilance of a man who knew that the world could take things without warning, and she said, "All right." He rode to Wagon Mound the next morning, taking Elias with him, and while he was gone, Lavinia taught the boys their lessons and made bread and tried very hard not to spend the entire day at the window. She spent most of it at the window. He came back in the early evening, dusty and tired, and he said that Barrett had taken the copies of the journal pages and had heard the whole account of Harlan Greer with the expression of a man who had heard worse and would handle it. He had also said that he had already received a telegraph message from a Kansas associate asking whether a woman named Lavinia Townsend had been seen in the territory, which confirmed that Greer had resources and was using them. "He knows I am in New Mexico," she said. "He suspects. He is looking broadly." Barrett said the telegraph message was general, sent to several counties. "That narrows with time." "Yes," Bernard said. "So we are going to be married." She stared at him. He had the good grace to look slightly abashed by his own delivery. He said, "I had intended to ask that with considerably more. I apologize. What I mean is," he stopped, took a breath, tried again. He said, "Lavinia, I want to ask you to marry me. I want to ask it because I love you and because the boys love you and because this house is more itself with you in it than it has been since Catherine died, and none of that has to do with Harlan Greer. But there is also the practical reality that a married woman on a registered ranch is harder to pursue across state lines than a single woman who can be characterized as a runaway, and the legal protections of marriage are not nothing. Both things are true. I want you to know both things, and I want you to make whatever choice is right for you." Lavinia thought about the first morning. She thought about the journal hidden under her wardrobe board. She thought about Thomas's face when he slid the plate across the table. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." The expression on his face in response to that single word was the most complete and unguarded thing she had ever seen on a grown man's face, and she stored it away in the part of her memory reserved for things she intended to keep forever. They married at the end of October at the courthouse in Wagon Mound, with Tom Barrett and his wife as witnesses and the boys in their Sunday clothes, and Thomas holding a bouquet of dried prairie flowers. He had assembled with careful seriousness from the late-season growth along the creek. Elias, who had maintained his watchful reserve for the entire month of Lavinia's residence at the ranch, shook her hand after the ceremony with the grave formality of a young man who has decided someone is trustworthy and is choosing to indicate this. It meant more to her than most things that had been said or done that day. Bernard kissed her on the courthouse steps in the autumn light with his hat in his hands and Wagon Mound going about its business around them. And it was nothing like the accidental kiss in the kitchen. It was deliberate and warm, and lasted exactly long enough to make Tom Barrett's wife sigh, and Thomas whisper something to Samuel that made Samuel laugh. The honeymoon, such as it was, consisted of 2 days during which the boys went a stay with the Cardwells, and Bernard and Lavinia had the ranch to themselves, which was enough. She would remember those 2 days for the rest of her life, not for any particular dramatic event, but for the quality of the time, its unhurried intimacy, the sense of 2 private people discovering each other fully, the way he looked at her in the morning like she was something he had not dared believe in and now could not quite believe was real. She moved the journal into the locked strongbox where he kept the ranch deeds. She felt, for the first time in 2 years, that she was not alone with what she knew. Harlan Greer arrived in Wagon Mound in the first week of November. Lavinia was in town when he arrived. She had driven the buckboard in for supplies: flour, salt, coffee, the particular thread she needed for Elia's coat which she was mending, and she had turned a corner between the general store and the post office and walked directly into the man who had destroyed 2 years of her life. He looked exactly the same. This was somehow the most disturbing thing about him: the good suit, the pleasant face, the way he smiled at her with the complete practiced ease of a man who had decided in advance exactly how this conversation would go. "Lavinia," he said, "what a coincidence." "It is not a coincidence," she said. She was proud of how steady her voice was. Her heart was doing something terrible in her chest, but her voice was entirely her own. "No," he agreed pleasantly, "it is not." His eyes went to her left hand, to the plain gold ring Bernard had put there in Wagon Mound's courthouse. Something moved in his face, not hurt, nothing human enough for that, a brief recalculation. "I see you have been busy. You need to leave this county," she said. "You need to go back to Kansas." "I need my property returned," he said. "And your signed statement, withdrawing any complaints or allegations you may have made to any authorities, in exchange for which I will withdraw my interest in your current situation entirely." The smile remained exactly in place. "It is a reasonable offer." "It is a threat," she said. "It is a resolution," he said. "What you have been telling people, Lavinia, what you told that circuit judge, what I suspect you may have told the federal investigator who has been sniffing around Abilene land records." The smile did not waver, but something else did, something in the eyes. It could cause significant problems for a number of significant people. "I have friends who would rather those problems did not develop." "Your friends are criminals," she said, "and you killed Cy Watkins." She had not planned to say that either. But she was tired of the careful dance, tired of managing the distance between what she knew and what she said. For one instant only, the pleasant face showed her something else, something cold and ancient and absolutely without scruple. Then the smile returned, and he said, "Cy Watkins fell down a ravine," and tipped his hat to her and walked away down the street. She stood on the boardwalk outside the post office in Wagon Mound and breathed until her hands stopped shaking. Then she went inside and sent a telegraph message to Judge Marcus Holt and another to Tom Barrett, and then she drove the buckboard home. Bernard was in the yard when she came through the gate. He took one look at her face and said nothing. He came to her side of the buckboard and helped her down and held her for a moment right there in the yard, and she said into his shoulder, "He is here. He is in Wagon Mound." "I know," Bernard said. "Barrett sent a rider. He got the message." He was calm in the way she had come to understand was not the absence of feeling but its most concentrated form. He held her at arm's length and looked at her face and said, "Are you hurt?" "No," she said. "He made an offer. He wants the journal and my silence in exchange for going away." "That is not something you are going to give him," Bernard said. "No," she said. "It is not." "Good," he said. "Because we are past the point where giving him anything would make him go away." Over the next week, the careful machinery of frontier justice, slow, imperfect, and ultimately real, moved around Harlan Greer with the determination of something that had been set in motion and could not now be stopped. The federal investigator, a man named Calloway from the Department of Justice, arrived in Wagon Mound on the Thursday following Greer's appearance. He had been working the land fraud case from a different direction for 6 months, and Lavinia's journal was the connective tissue that joined his evidence to the pattern he had been trying to prove. Calloway came to the ranch on the Friday. He was a thin, precise man from Ohio who wore a brown wool suit and asked questions with the focused intensity of someone who had done this a very long time. He sat at the same kitchen table where Thomas had set a plate for Lavinia 6 weeks earlier, and he went through the journal page by page, and he asked her to account for every entry and every date, and she did so for 3 hours. At the end of it he said, "Mrs. Donovan, I want you to understand that this is going to take time in the courts. Land fraud of this scope, across multiple counties and what appears to be multiple years, there will be proceedings and appeals. It is not a simple matter." "I know," she said. "I have been waiting 2 years already," he said. "It will likely take 2 more, but with what you have given me, and with the land records that Judge Holt has assembled, and with the testimony of 2 other witnesses we have located who knew Cy Watkins," he paused, "Harlan Greer is not going to be in a position to threaten anyone much longer." She thought about Cy Watkins, who had tried to do the right thing and had not survived it. She thought about the first time she had seen that cleaned-out look in Harlan's eyes. She said, "He told me Cy Watkins fell down a ravine." Calloway said, "We know he did not." That night Bernard sat with her on the porch of the ranch house in the cold November air, wrapped in blankets, looking out at the high desert under a sky full of stars so thick they were almost a texture. The Milky Way ran across the sky from south to north like a road. "It is going to be all right," she said, testing the words to see if she believed them. "Yes," he said, with the particular certainty she had come to love about him, not the false certainty of a man trying to reassure her, but the real certainty of a man who had looked at the available facts and reached a conclusion. "It will take time," she said. "Time I have," he said. He reached under the blanket and found her hand. "We have." She turned her head to look at him in the starlight. She thought about the woman she had been in Abilene, moving through her days in a state of managed fear, keeping secrets alone, writing letters to judges who did not write back. She thought about all the places she had been before she arrived here, all the rooms that had not quite been home. She said, "Bernard." He said, "Yes." "I love you," she said. "I want to say it plainly because I have not been in the habit of saying plain things about how I feel, and I am trying to change that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Lavinia, I have loved you since you sat down at this table and asked Thomas what he dreamed about." She had not known that. She had not known that something so specific and early had been the moment for him. She thought about it now, the first night, the dust on her shoulders, the plate set before she asked, and she felt the tears again. The easy ones that she was gradually learning were not weakness but the opposite of it. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the cold and the stars and the desert silence wrapped around them both, and somewhere in the barn Thomas's particular horse, a gray mare called Silver Thread, made a sound in the night that might have been contentment. Harlan Greer was arrested in Las Vegas, New Mexico, on the 22nd of November, 1882. He was held on charges of federal land fraud and conspiracy, and subsequently transferred to Topeka, Kansas, where the primary case was to be tried. Calloway came to the ranch to tell them personally, which Lavinia appreciated. Greer's arrest did not close the case. The legal proceedings would indeed take years, and there would be depositions and circuit court dates, and the long administrative machinery of federal justice moving at its own pace. But it meant Harlan Greer was behind a locked door and could not send associates to search rooms or ask quiet questions of landlady women. Lavinia sat with the news for an hour after Calloway left, alone in the kitchen because Bernard had taken the boys out to check the fence line and she needed the solitude. She sat with it and felt something she had been carrying for 2 years, not the journal, not the evidence, but something underneath it, a constant tension in her chest like a wire drawn too tight slowly, carefully release. She was not yet free of it entirely. The legal case would take time. There might be more depositions. She might need to travel to Topeka to testify. The hidden motive Greer had always claimed was hers. The scorned woman, the vengeful ex-fiancé, the story he would tell in his defense, would be aired in court and she would have to sit through it. But she was not alone with it. She had not been alone with it since the Sunday she had put the journal on the kitchen table and Bernard Donovan had said, "Of course I believe you." Winter came to the New Mexico territory the way it always does in that high desert country, abruptly and with conviction. Clear, cold days and nights that went to 10 below, the mountains to the north capped white. The cattle moved to the southern pasture, where the creek kept a line of green along its banks even in the freeze. Bernard and Elias worked hard through those weeks, and Lavinia and the younger boys held the ranch house and its domestic geography. And in the evenings, the 5 of them gathered around the kitchen table, or the parlor stove and played cards or read or sat in the comfortable silence of a household that had become, in the space of a few months, genuinely itself. Thomas began to improve. This was something Lavinia noticed first in small ways. He talked more freely at dinner, asked questions that required considered answers, showed an interest in things beyond the immediate farm yard. She had begun, carefully, to expand his lessons. He was reading at a level 2 years beyond his age. He was doing arithmetic that made Samuel, who was perfectly reasonable with numbers, visibly competitive. He had inherited his father's concentrated intelligence, without the protective casing his father had built around his, and the result was a child of considerable inner brightness. In January, she had a conversation with Bernard about Thomas and school that went entirely differently from their previous conversation on the subject. She suggested, gently, that she might be able to teach Thomas at home at a level that a one-room schoolhouse would not match, and that this would allow him the education his mind required without forcing the separation that still frightened him. Bernard listened to this proposal with the full attention she had come to treasure in him, and then said that he thought she was right, and that he was grateful she had found a way to frame it that he could accept. And she understood that this was as close as he was going to come to saying that the previous conversation had moved something in him too. Samuel, who had been watching Lavinia since her arrival with a combination of friendly interest and thoughtful assessment, came to her one cold January evening while she was mending and said, with the direct earnestness that was his particular quality, that he was glad she had stayed. "I was not sure you would," he said. After the man came to Wagon Mound, she looked at him, 11 years old, with Catherine's eyes, which she knew now because Bernard had shown her the one daguerreotype of Catherine that existed, a formal portrait from their wedding in 1869, a young woman with a steady gaze and considerable dignity. "I was not going to let a man like that determine where I stayed," she said. Samuel considered this. "Papa was afraid," he said, "after you saw the man. He was afraid you might decide it was better for everyone if you left." She put down the mending. "He said that to you?" "No," Samuel said. "I could tell." She looked at the boy, at his mother's eyes and his father's jaw, and the completely matter-of-fact way he delivered this observation, as though it had simply needed saying, and he was the one available to say it, and she felt something she could only call love, uncomplicated and certain. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Tell him that if you want to." Samuel said. "He already knows," and picked up his book and returned to the sofa with the complete satisfaction of a child who has accomplished something. Spring came. The case against Harlan Greer moved forward in its slow, deliberate way through the federal courts in Kansas. Calloway wrote monthly letters that Bernard read aloud at the kitchen table, translating the legal language into plain facts. Two of Greer's associates had agreed to provide testimony in exchange for reduced charges. The land records were confirmed to match Lavinia's journal entries. 3 former homesteaders whose land had been fraudulently transferred had been located and were cooperating with the investigation. Greer had engaged a very expensive attorney in Topeka who was making the proceedings as slow as possible, which Calloway had warned would happen. But the architecture of the case was sound. It was, as he put it in his methodical way, built on solid ground. In April, Lavinia discovered she was pregnant. She told Bernard on a Tuesday evening in the way she had learned to tell him important things directly, without preamble, while he was occupied with something else, because his best responses happened when he was not braced for information. He was cleaning his rifle at the kitchen table, which was a weekly habit, and she said, "I am going to have a child." He stopped what he was doing. He put the rifle down. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It took her a moment to identify it because she had not expected it, had expected gravity and care, and the responsible consideration he brought to everything. But what she saw was joy. Simple, uncomplicated, luminous joy, the kind that belongs to the part of a person that loss cannot entirely reach. He stood up and came to her and took her face in his large, weathered hands and kissed her forehead, then her mouth, then held her against his chest for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "Are you well?" she said. "I am very well," he said. "I want to tell the boys." She laughed because it had come out so immediately, this desire to share it, and because the laugh was itself a revelation. She laughed freely with this man in a way she had not laughed in years. They told the boys at dinner that evening. Samuel made a sound of pure excitement and immediately began to enumerate the reasons why a baby brother would be superior to a baby sister, which occupied him at some length. Elias, who was 15 now, and conducting himself with a young man's careful dignity, allowed a genuine smile to cross his face before he reabsorbed it and said, with the brief expressiveness that was his version of enthusiasm, "That was good news." Thomas looked at Lavinia across the table with his particular lucid gaze and said, "I know. I dreamed that too." Bernard caught Lavinia's eye across the table, and she saw in his face the same barely contained delight she felt in her own chest, and they looked at each other in the lamplight above the heads of their children, and she thought, "This is the whole of it. This is what safe feels like. This is what love is, not the performance of it, not the tactical use of it, but the actual living structure of it, built of small morning coffees and evening conversations, and a child setting a plate before you were asked." The summer of 1883 moved through its days with the particular richness of a year that contains more events than time usually permits. Lavinia continued to teach Thomas at home, and increasingly also supervised Elias' reading, who had developed an appetite for history that she was delighted to feed. Bernard expanded the cattle operation, hiring a permanent hand named Eddie Ruiz, whose family was from the territory, and who had more practical knowledge of the land and its seasons than anyone else in the area, and who became, over the following months, someone Lavinia came to think of as essential to the working rhythm of the ranch. In July, she traveled to Topeka to give her deposition in the Greer case. Bernard accompanied her, and they left the boys in the care of the Cardwells, and they rode the stage and the railroad north through country that Lavinia had last seen in the dark urgency of flight. Traveling it now, at Bernard's side, with his steady presence and the plain gold ring on her hand, was an entirely different experience, not without tension, because going back toward the territory where Harlan Greer had operated required a particular kind of courage from her, but a tension she could carry because she was not carrying it alone. She gave her deposition in a wood-paneled room in the federal courthouse in Topeka, with Calloway beside her and Greer's expensive attorney across the table, who asked questions designed to characterize her as a vindictive former fiancée, and whom she answered with the careful precision of a woman who had been preparing for this moment for 3 years. She was precise. She was specific. She referred repeatedly to dates and figures and transactions that matched the land records exactly. The attorney's manner grew more clipped as the session progressed. Afterward, Calloway said, "You are an exceptional witness, Mrs. Donovan," she said. "I have been waiting 3 years to say all of it." Greer himself was brought into the room at the end of the second day for a brief procedural matter. He looked smaller than she remembered, not physically, but in the way that people who have been confined look when you encounter them after you have grown beyond the reach of their particular damage. He looked at her across the room with the controlled, pleasant expression that she now understood was all there was of him, the surface without substance, and she held his gaze with complete calm. She was not afraid of him anymore. She was angry on behalf of Cy Watkins and on behalf of every homesteader whose land had been taken, and the anger was clean and purposeful, but the fear was gone entirely. She thought it had been gone since the morning she put the journal on the table, and Bernard Donovan had said, "Of course, I believe you," without a moment's hesitation. Bernard was waiting for her in the corridor outside. He looked at her face when she came out, and he understood immediately what she needed, which was not words but proximity. He took her hand and they walked out of the federal courthouse into the Kansas summer heat together, and she breathed the open air, and it tasted of freedom. They spent one night in Topeka in a respectable hotel, their first night away from the ranch together and alone. They ate dinner in the hotel dining room, which had white tablecloths and a piano player, and they talked for hours the way they talked best, rangy, unhurried, moving through subjects with the ease of two people who have no agenda with each other. He told her something she had not known, that he had come to New Mexico from Missouri in 1871, a young man of 22 with $100 and a belief in the idea of the West that the West had promptly and comprehensively dismantled and replaced with something better. He told her about the first years, the failed homestead, the cattle work for other men, the slow accumulation of what became the ranch. He told her that he had been ready to go back to Missouri in 1874 and had met Catherine on a Thursday in March in Las Vegas and had not left. She told him about her mother's poetry books, still packed in the bottom of her carpetbag. She told him about the years she had spent being moved between relatives after her father died, the sense of being surplus. She told him about the first time she had understood that the life she was supposed to want, dependent, decorative, gratefully attaching herself to any man willing to take her on, was not the life she was going to accept, and the cost of that understanding, which had been considerable. He said, "The man who wrote to the Register, 'What were you expecting when you answered?' she said. 'I was expecting functional. I was expecting workable. I was not expecting.'" She made a gesture that took in the room and the dinner and him, and by implication, everything else. He said, "Neither was I. The journey home was long and familiar and comfortable in a way the journey out had not been." She slept against his shoulder for 100 miles and woke to find him awake and watching the landscape pass, and she stayed where she was and he did not move, and the train carried them south and west back toward the territory and the ranch and the boys and the life they were building. Their son was born in November of 1883, on a cold, clear morning when the desert light was the color of pale gold and the smell of frost was sharp in the air. He came into the world with Bernard's jaw and Lavinia's eyes, and a set of opinions about his situation that he expressed with considerable volume, which Elias, standing outside the closed bedroom door with the younger boys, said was a good sign. They named him William James Donovan, James for Bernard's father and William because Lavinia had always loved the sound of it. Thomas was the one who came in first, after the doctor and the neighbor woman who had helped had finished and gone, and he stood at the side of the bed and looked at his new brother in Lavinia's arms with the same complete certainty he had brought to everything since the first night, and he said, "I dreamed him too. His name is William." "It is," Lavinia said, and she gave him to Thomas to hold carefully with the supervision of all four adults in the room, and Thomas held him with an innate gentleness that made Lavinia's heart so full she could barely contain it. Bernard sat on the edge of the bed beside her and held her hand and looked at his son in Thomas's arms, and she could see on his face the same complex of grief and gratitude that parenthood always carried, the memory of what had been lost alongside the fact of what existed now, the impossible weight of love and the equal impossibility of not bearing it. He said very quietly only to her, "Thank you," she said. "We did this together." He said, "I know, thank you anyway." She turned her hand over and held his, the way she had held it on that Sunday morning when she put the journal on the table, and the world reorganized itself around an honest act. William James Donovan grew at the extraordinary pace of infants, which is to say, he seemed to change entirely each time you looked at him. By spring, he was a sturdy, observant baby who regarded the world with what Lavinia privately thought was his father's concentrated attention in miniature form. He was adored comprehensively by all three of his brothers. Elias with the quiet, steady devotion he brought to everything important, Samuel with an enthusiastic engagement that occasionally required supervision, and Thomas with the particular tenderness that had been his signal quality since before the baby was born. The ranch expanded again in the spring of 1884, when Bernard purchased the adjacent parcel to the east 200 acres of grass and creek that had come available when the previous holder moved back to his family in Ohio, and began running a larger herd. Eddie Ruiz took on more responsibility for the day-to-day cattle management. Elias, who was 17 and had inherited his father's steadiness, along with a natural gift for numbers, took on the account-keeping with Lavinia's guidance, and she found in teaching him this skill a satisfaction that went beyond the practical. Elias was the one who surprised her most in the long run. In the beginning he had been a wall, watchful, courteous, impenetrable. She had not pushed. She had simply been consistently present, consistently herself, and somewhere in the months between her arrival and the spring of 1880, for the wall had come down, not all at once but in increments, the way good things happen. He began talking to her in the evenings, first about the accounts and the ranch and practical matters, and gradually about other things about Missouri, which Bernard had told him about but he had never seen, about whether the territory would achieve statehood in his lifetime, about books, which turned out to be something he had always wanted more of and never asked for. She ordered books for him from Santa Fe, which arrived in small parcels on the supply wagon and were received by Elias with an expression he did not quite manage to make casual. History, primarily. Some philosophy. One novel, Dickens, which he read in 2 days and brought back to her with the look of someone who has discovered an entire continent they had not known was there. She loved him for that look. She loved all three of them for specific and distinct reasons that had nothing to do with each other, and everything to do with who each of them was: Elias for his quiet depth, Samuel for his open-hearted humor, Thomas for his uncanny inner knowledge. They were Catherine's boys and Bernard's boys and hers, and the fact that she had arrived in their house as a stranger fleeing a dark past and had become part of the structure of it felt, in her calmer moments, like the kind of story she might have read in one of her mother's books. In June of 1884, Harlan Greer was convicted in the federal court in Topeka on multiple counts of land fraud and conspiracy. The verdict was not a surprise. Calloway had indicated the evidence was overwhelming, but the official closing of it, the formal end of the threat she had carried for 4 years, was something she needed to sit with alone for a time before she could celebrate it. She went down to the creek after the letter arrived, leaving William with Bernard and the older boys, and she sat on the flat rock at the bend where the water ran fast and clear over the stones, and she took out the letter and read it again, and she thought about Cy Watkins and the families whose land had been taken and the 2 years she had spent in Abilene in managed fear, and she let herself feel the full weight of all of it, the betrayal, the hidden motives, the forced silence, the dark past that had shaped everything that came after. And then she let it settle, the way water settles after the current passes over the stones, and she looked at the creek and the cottonwoods and the mountains north of the valley, and she thought, I am here. I stayed. I told the truth. It was enough. She walked back to the ranch house and found Bernard in the yard with William on his hip, watching the baby's fascinated investigation of a beetle on the fence post. He looked up when she came through the gate. He read her face the way he always did, thoroughly and without comment, and he waited. She said, he was convicted. Bernard's face showed in sequence relief, then something older and quieter, the particular satisfaction of a man who has protected his family and seen the threat removed. He said, good, she said. I want to write to Pearl Simmons, the woman in Abilene who warned me. I want her to know. He said, write it tonight. She said, I will. She went inside and wrote it at the kitchen table, the same table where everything had happened, the first plate, the first confession, the first morning coffee, all of it. And the letter was 2 pages of plain, honest gratitude and the assurance that the matter was closed. After she sealed it, she sat and looked around the kitchen in the late afternoon light. The cast iron stove that sometimes required coaxing, the shelf of tin cups and the good china that came out for important occasions, the hand mill where she ground coffee at dawn, the floor with the particular creak in the board near the window that she had learned to step around because it woke William when he slept in the morning. She looked at all of it and felt the same thing she had felt that first night, lying in the east-facing room with the freshly washed quilt, listening to the horses shift in the barn. She felt that she might survive whatever came next, except now it was better than surviving. Now she was, entirely and without qualification, home. The year turned into 1885 and then 1886, and the Donovan Ranch grew into itself the way good things grow, not explosively but steadily, each year building on the last. The cattle operation expanded to 600 head. Eddie Ruiz brought his younger brother Ramon to work the ranch in the second year, and Ramon was as skilled with horses as his brother was with cattle. And Thomas, who was now 12 and working seriously with the horses, found in Ramon a teacher who met him at his level and expanded what he knew. Elias turned 18 in the spring of 1885, and with it came a different quality of adulthood, not a sudden change but an arrival, the completion of something that had been building since the year Lavinia came to the ranch. He was not much like the watchful, closed boy she had met. He was still quiet, still more comfortable with action than words, but the depth was open now rather than closed, and he had a humor that came out in dry, unexpected moments, and a care for his brothers that ran quiet and deep, and a respect for Lavinia that he expressed in the particular way she had come to recognize as Donovan, not frequently stated but consistently evidenced. He began courting a young woman named Alma Cardwell, the second daughter of the neighboring family, in the summer of 1885. He did this with the same deliberate carefulness he brought to everything else, and Lavinia watched it with the particular combination of tenderness and amusement that she was increasingly discovering was the specific experience of parenting older children. Bernard watched it with a quiet satisfaction, and one evening he said to Lavinia, "He knows what to look for in a person." "I think he learned some of it from you," she said. "He already knew he needed someone to confirm it." Bernard said, "Yes, but you confirmed it." Samuel at 13 was a different kind of presence in the household, sociable, gregarious, the boy who knew everyone in Wagon Mound and Las Vegas and all the ranches in between. He had inherited Catherine's gift for people, an easy warmth that drew others toward him without effort, and he was not strategic about it. It was simply how he was. He was also genuinely funny, which William would later cite as his primary early memory of childhood, Sam making everyone at the table laugh. Thomas, at 12 and 13, was the one who continued to astonish her. He was not performing when he said he dreamed things. This was the conclusion she had reached after 3 years of observation. Not that he had supernatural gifts exactly, but that he had a quality of inner perception that seemed to reach further than most people's, a sensitivity to the emotional landscape of the people around him that expressed itself, sometimes, as an awareness that looked like prediction. He knew when someone was unhappy before they said so. He knew when the weather was coming before the signs were visible. He knew in the spring of 1885 that Lavinia was pregnant again before she told Bernard, because he came to her one morning while she was in the kitchen garden and said, with his characteristic matter-of-fact certainty, "There's going to be another one, isn't there?" It was not a question. She looked at him at 12 years old, standing in the morning light with dirt on his hands from the horse barn, those particular eyes that she had come to think of as something more than just their color, and she said, "Yes." He said, "Good. William needs someone to look after." The second baby was a daughter. She arrived in November of 1885, which made her and William exactly 2 years apart, and she was born with a full head of dark hair and the same alert, focused gaze that seemed to be a Donovan characteristic. And she was named Clara, for Lavinia's mother, which was a decision that required very little discussion between Lavinia and Bernard because he had suggested it, and she had been unable to speak for a moment, and her silence was sufficient answer. Clara Donovan came into a household that was ready for her in the way that second children have the good fortune of entering households that have been broken in by the first. William, who was 2 and extremely opinionated about his universe, initially regarded her with the suspicion of a small person encountering a dramatic rearrangement, and then underwent a fairly rapid conversion to the position Thomas had predicted: protector, devoted older brother, her loudest defender in any dispute he witnessed from that point forward for the rest of his childhood. Bernard sat in the chair beside the bed after the birth and held Clara while Lavinia slept, and when she woke he was still there, the baby asleep on his chest, his large hand curved around her with the same careful sureness he brought to everything important. He looked up when Lavinia opened her eyes. "She looks like your mother's photograph." She looked at the baby. She thought about her mother, who had loved poetry and died too soon, and who had not been able to stay long enough to see the life her daughter eventually built from the wreckage of the years between. She thought about how grief worked across time, how it did not diminish but became something you carried differently, something that left room for what came after. "She does a little," she said. "I like that," he said. "I like it too," she said. She held out her arms, and he transferred Clara to her with the practiced sureness of a man who had done this before and trusted himself to do it well. And Lavinia held her daughter in the November morning light and felt the full and uncomplicated fact of her life. The years that followed were, by any honest accounting, good years. Not uncomplicated years. No years with a working ranch and 5 children and the ordinary commerce of a family's daily life are uncomplicated but good ones, built on solid ground, with a foundation that had been tested early and had held. There were hard things. There were always hard things. A cattle disease in the winter of 1886 that killed 40 head and required the kind of financial recalculation that kept Bernard at his desk for several evenings. A bad fall that Samuel took from a horse in 1887 that broke his arm cleanly and healed completely, but that required 2 weeks of Lavinia nursing him through a pain he tried very hard and not entirely successfully to manage with dignity. A fire in the eastern barn in the spring of 1888, which Eddie and Ramon caught early and controlled before it reached the horses, and which required the whole ranch to rebuild the structure over the summer in the particular cooperative way that frontier communities handled such things. There were very good things, too. Elias married Alma Cardwell in June of 1887 in a ceremony at the Wagon Mound Church that the entire county attended, it seemed, and which was the occasion of the best dinner Lavinia had ever cooked, and also the occasion of Bernard dancing with her in the cleared space outside the church building under a string of lanterns, which was something she had not known he could do, and which caused her to reassess a number of assumptions. He was not elegant, but he was fully committed to the endeavor, and he held her with his whole attention, and she laughed, and he smiled a full smile, both sides, the one he kept mainly for her, and it was one of those evenings she would remember with complete sensory precision for the rest of her life. Samuel, in 1888, won a place at a preparatory school in Santa Fe, associated with the Catholic mission, which he had applied to without telling anyone until the acceptance came, which was such a perfectly Samuel thing to do that the entire family found it impossible to be anything but delighted. Bernard drove him to the rail station at Las Vegas in September with the composure of a man who had said what needed to be said at home and was not going to revisit it in public. And when he came back that evening, Lavinia found him in the barn with the horses in the way he sometimes needed to be. And she did not go in, but she left a lamp lit in the kitchen window. And when he came inside eventually, she had coffee on the stove, and she said nothing about the barn, and he said nothing about his face. And they sat together in the kitchen quiet until the evening became night. Thomas, who was 16 in 1889, had by that time established himself as the best horse trainer in 4 counties. Ramon Ruiz, who had become both his mentor and his collaborator, said openly that Thomas Donovan had a gift that you did not teach and could not learn, and Thomas accepted this assessment with the same uncomplicated matter-of-factness with which he had accepted his own nature since the beginning. He had a string of horses he had trained from difficult animals into something remarkable, and ranchers came from as far as Taos to acquire them. Bernard watched this with the quiet pride of a father who had always known, and had been patient enough to allow the knowing to develop into itself. In 1889, Lavinia received a letter from Judge Marcus Holt informing her that the last of the appeals in the Greer case had been exhausted, and that Harlan Greer's conviction was final. He had been sentenced to 12 years in the federal penitentiary. The homesteaders whose land had been fraudulently taken had received restitution in several cases, partial in others. The mechanism of justice had been incomplete, as it always was, as the territory of 1882 did not allow for perfection in these matters. But it had been real. It had been enough. She brought the letter to Bernard that evening. She had not said anything about Greer in years, not because it was forbidden, but because there was genuinely nothing left to say. The wound had closed, the case had concluded, the fear had gone. She brought the letter because he had been there for every step of it, and he deserved to know the final step. He read it. He said, "Good." Then he said, "Are you all right?" She thought about this honestly, in the way she had learned to think about things from years of living with a man who deserved honest answers. She said, "I am better than all right. I am finished with that part." He said, "Cy Watkins." She said, "Yes, I still think about him." She paused. "I think the honest part is that justice never fully serves the dead. It serves the living, and that matters, but it does not bring anyone back." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "No, it does not." She knew he was thinking of Catherine. She knew because they had learned over 7 years of marriage to be inside each other's silences that way, not to complete them or fix them, but to be present in them, which was a different and more honest form of intimacy. She took his hand. He held it. They sat on the porch that evening, the same porch where they had sat in the cold starlight in November of 1882, looking at the Milky Way. And now it was spring, warmer, the desert beginning its brief season of green, the mountains to the north still carrying snow at their tops. William, who was 5, was chasing something across the yard with the total conviction of 5-year-old pursuit. Clara, who was 3, was sitting in the dirt near the porch steps engaged in a serious project involving pebbles and a tin cup that had her complete attention. Thomas was somewhere in the barn. Elias was at his own house now, just a mile and a half east along the creek, the new house he and Bernard and Eddie had built the year after the wedding. Bernard and Lavinia sat on the porch in the spring evening and watched their children and the land, and she thought about the plate. She had thought about it many times over the 7 years between that first evening and this one, because it was the image that contained everything. The plate sliding across the worn oak table before she asked, the small act of anticipating a need, the radical ordinary kindness of it. She had once asked Thomas what had made him do it. This was a year or 2 into her time at the ranch when they were comfortable enough with each other for the question to be asked easily. He had looked at her with those particular eyes and said, "You looked so tired, and you looked like someone who had been taking care of yourself alone for a very long time. I thought someone should take care of you instead." She had not been able to say anything for a moment. Then she had said, "You were right." He had said, "I know." She told Bernard this story one evening. She had not told it before, and he had been quiet for a time, and then he had said, "He is very like Catherine in that way. She saw everything." She had not known that about Catherine. She had been gathering the portrait of the woman who had come before her for 7 years, not with any jealousy but with a genuine desire to know, to understand the full history of the place she inhabited. She said, "Tell me more about that." And Bernard, who had been careful about Catherine not from withholding but from the protective instinct of a man who feared imposing grief on someone else, told her about Catherine's perceptiveness, her humor, her directness, the quality she had of understanding what people needed before they asked for it, which was where Thomas had gotten it from. Lavinia said, "I would have liked her." Bernard said, "She would have liked you. She would have liked you very much." This was, she thought afterward, one of the most generous things he had ever said to her, and he had said many generous things. The years moved forward. Elias and Alma had their first child, a boy, in 1888, and another in 1890, and the Donovan Ranch, which had once been a widower, and 3 boys became, gradually, and then all at once, the kind of place that was full of people and seasons and the accumulated history of a family that had made itself on this particular ground. Samuel came home from Santa Fe in the summers and was a different person each time, larger, more informed, more engaged with the wider world, and each summer it was both disorienting and absolutely right to have him back at the kitchen table. Thomas did not leave. This was not a failure of imagination or opportunity. He left briefly, at 17, to work a horse training contract in Albuquerque that lasted 3 months, and came back because this was the land that made sense to him, and he knew his own nature clearly enough by then to make the choice without equivocation. He was the one who stayed, who went on working the ranch alongside his father and Eddie and Ramon, who was present for the small daily continuity of the place in a way that Lavinia found both reassuring and quietly moving. In 1891, on a September morning very like the morning she had arrived, Lavinia sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and looked out the window at the yard. Bernard was in the north pasture with Thomas and Eddie. William, who was 8, was in the barn with a very strong opinion about something, which she could not hear clearly but could read by the expressive semaphore of his movements through the barn door. Clara, who was 6, was sitting on the porch steps with the cat, which was an old and tolerant animal who had been acquired at some point she could not quite remember and had become completely woven into the fabric of the household. She had a letter on the table beside her coffee cup. It was from Pearl Simmons in Abilene, who had never stopped writing. Pearl's letters were windows into a world Lavinia had left, and she received them with affection. This one contained news that Pearl had married a good man, a grain merchant, and that Abilene had grown considerably, and that the boarding house where they had both lived was now a hotel, and that she was glad Lavinia had gotten where she was going and found what she had found. Lavinia read the letter and set it down and looked out at the yard and thought about what she had found. She thought about the full accounting of it, the fear that had driven her here, and the luck of the right advertisement at the right moment, and the plate set before she asked, and the Sunday morning with the journal on the table, and Bernard saying, "Of course I believe you," and Thomas dreaming William and dreaming Clara and knowing things before they were said, and Elia's face when he received the first parcel of books, and Samuel laughing, and the porch in the cold November starlight, and the 2 years of legal proceedings, and the barn after Samuel left for school, and the spring evening with William chasing something across the yard and Clara and her pebbles, and Bernard's hands, always. Bernard's hands large and weathered and careful with everything that mattered. She thought, I left Abilene with a leather journal and a carpetbag and a stone in my chest, and I arrived here with all of those things and nothing else, and now I have all of this. She heard the yard gate and Bernard came through it, crossing toward the house with his hat pushed back on his head, the way he wore it when the sun was not directly overhead. He looked up and saw her in the window and raised one hand, not a wave exactly, more an acknowledgement, the specific language of a man and woman who had been reading each other across distances for 9 years. She raised her hand in return. He came in through the kitchen door and she poured him coffee without being asked, which was itself something she had not been aware of beginning to do, but which was, when she considered it, a kind of echo of the first thing, someone anticipating a need, someone saying without words, "I see you, I know you, you do not have to ask." He sat down across from her and put his hat on the table. He looked at the letter. "Pearl," he said. "She married well," Lavinia said. "She sounds happy." He said, "Good." He picked up his coffee. He looked at her in the morning light, the same steady, unhurried regard she had been the recipient of for 9 years, the look that had never become routine because it was never performed. He said, "I was thinking." "That is rarely trouble," she said. He smiled, the full one. "We have not been to Santa Fe since the year William was born," he said. "I thought we might take the children in October, the whole family, Elias and Alma too, if they want to come." She considered this. October in Santa Fe, the aspens would be turning, the high mountain air cool and sharp, the market streets busy with the autumn trade. She thought about her children seeing the city, the cathedral, the plaza, the mixture of cultures and goods that made Santa Fe unlike anywhere else in the territory. She thought about Bernard walking beside her through the market with the easy, unhurried pleasure of a man who has earned the right to enjoy things. "Yes," she said. "Let us do that." He nodded. He drank his coffee. He looked out the window at the yard where Clara had relocated herself, and the cat from the porch steps to the middle of the yard for reasons known only to Clara. He said, without looking away from the window, "Lavinia," she said. "Yes." He said, "I have been meaning to say something for a while and I keep finding other things to say instead." She waited. He said, "What you did, coming here, trusting us with it, all of it, the journal, the situation, everything. What it cost you to do that, coming from where you were after what you had been through." He paused. "I think about it. I want you to know I think about it." She said, "What do you think about it?" He turned from the window and looked at her. He said, "I think that you could have gone anywhere. I think you could have run farther. I think you chose to stop running when you sat down at that table and a 9-year-old boy set a plate in front of you, and you let it be enough to stop running, and I think that took more courage than anything else you did." He paused. "I think I'm very glad you stopped here." She looked at him across the kitchen table, the same worn oak, the same morning light that had been present at every significant conversation they had ever had in this room. She thought about Thomas's plate. She thought about all the things that came after it, the good and the difficult, the years and the children and the building of this life from the material at hand. She said, So am I. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the way he had done on that Sunday morning 9 years ago when the journal sat between them, and the truth was newly spoken. She turned her hand over and held his. Outside, William came out of the barn with the resolution of a person who has won an argument, and Clara left the cat and went to investigate, and the morning went on around them. The horses and the creek, and the cottonwoods and the mountains, and the long clear light of the New Mexico Territory in September of 1891. And inside the kitchen Bernard and Lavinia Donovan held onto each other's hands in the ordinary miracle of a Tuesday morning at home. The plate had been set before she asked. All the rest had followed from that, and the rest had been, by every honest measure she possessed, more than enough. It had been everything. She would tell Clara the story someday. She had already told it to William, who had received it with the solemn gravity of a child absorbing a family myth. She would tell it to Elia's children when they were old enough. She would tell it the way her mother might have told a story from one of her poetry books, as a thing that was both particular and universal, both a single small act and the whole beginning of a life. Thomas had set a plate before she asked because he had looked at her and seen what she needed and decided to meet it. And she had sat down, and the rest was the story. It was, in the end, a love story. It had always been a love story, not the kind built on performance and dramatic declaration, though there had been a few of those as well, but the kind built on coffee in the early morning, and hands held across a table, and journals placed in trust and children who dreamed things and came true. The kind that started with a tin plate on an October evening and grew into something large enough to hold a life. That was enough. That was more than enough. That, finally and completely and without qualification, was everything.